It was an ordinary afternoon, the kind where people went about their day without giving much thought to the world around them. The sun was shining, and the streets buzzed with the usual hum of activity. Families enjoying the day, friends chatting, and strangers passing each other without a second glance. Among the crowd was a black woman, dressed casually, carrying a calm and confident air. She wasn't doing anything remarkable, simply existing, enjoying her day like anyone else. But for one woman nearby, that wasn't acceptable. A white woman mid-50s, with an air of entitlement that clung to her like perfume, noticed the black woman. Something about her, maybe her presence, maybe her confidence, seemed to set this woman off. Her eyes narrowed, and the shift in her demeanor was almost palpable. She stared, not with curiosity, but with suspicion, the kind that bubbles up when someone convinces themselves they're witnessing something wrong, even when nothing at all is happening. It started small, a sideways glance, then a longer look. Soon, it became clear that this wasn't a passing observation. The woman, the type many would call a Karen for a bold, unnecessary sense of authority, began to murmur under her breath, her expression twisting. She didn't see a woman simply go about her business. She saw a problem that needed fixing. She shifted closer, as if proximity gave her more reason to justify whatever narrative she was building in her head. The black woman, still unaware of the brewing storm, remained focused on whatever she was doing. She wasn't loud. She wasn't causing trouble. She was just there. And for Karen, that was enough to spark outrage. Her murmurs grew louder, and soon people nearby started noticing. Karen wasn't just observing anymore. She was talking, not directly to the black woman, but about her. The words were laced with that familiar tone, the one that implies wrongdoing without saying outright. Phrases like, "I don't think she belongs here," and "she looks suspicious," began to trickle into the air, poising the mood around her. People glanced, unsure whether to engage or ignore. After all, who wants to be the one to step into someone else's conflict? But Karen wasn't waiting for backup. She was working herself up, her voice growing bolder as her sense of righteousness inflated. Her feet planted firmly, she finally made her move. Without hesitation, she stepped forward, closing the distance. Her voice cut through the ambient noise, sharp and commanding. "Excuse me, what are you doing here?" The black woman looked up, surprised. For a second, she blinked, trying to process whether this stranger was talking to her. The confusion on her face only seemed to fuel Karen's fire. "I've been watching you," Karen continued, her voice loud enough now that people around them started to pay more attention. "You don't look like you belong here. Are you lost?" It wasn't a question born from concern. It was an accusation wrapped in a thin disguise. The words hung heavy, and a few onlookers shifted uncomfortably. The black woman didn't respond right away. Maybe she was stunned by the audacity. Maybe she was trying to figure out whether it was worth engaging with someone so clearly convinced of her own false reality. But Karen took the silence as confirmation that she was in the right. "You need to leave," she pressed on, her voice climbing with every word. "This area isn't for people like you." The weight of those words settled in the air like a fog. People like you. It wasn't subtle anymore. It wasn't disguised. It was raw, blatant prejudice, served up without a hint of shame. The black woman tilted her head slightly, a flicker of something, amusement, disbelief, maybe even pity, crossing her face. But she still didn't respond. Not yet. Karen, now feeling empowered by the attention she was gathering, turned to the nearby crowd. "Can someone call security? She shouldn't be here. She's probably up to something." It was as if she believed the more people she involved, the more legitimate her claims would become. Her voice shook with intensity, but it wasn't fear. It was anger, the kind that comes from a place of superiority. The crowd stirred, uncertain. A few people whispered to one another, unsure whether to intervene or stay quiet. After all, what if she was right? The seed of doubt had been planted, and Karen knew how to water it. All the while, the black woman remained still, her expression unreadable. She wasn't scared. She wasn't angry. It was like she was waiting to see just how far Karen would take this, waiting to decide if it was even worth her time. Karen's voice hit a new level. "Someone call the police," she practically barked. "She's probably a criminal or something. You never know with these people." The words landed like a slap, sharp and ugly. The crowd tensed. For a moment, it felt like the world held its breath. The black woman finally moved, slowly, deliberately. She reached into her pocket, and Karen's eyes widened. Her mouth opened, no doubt ready to scream something about weapons or danger. But the woman wasn't pulling out a weapon, not even close. Her hand emerged holding something small, compact, and unmistakable. An FBI badge, shining in the sunlight, reflecting back at Karen like a mirror showing her the truth she didn't want to see. And in that moment, everything shifted. Karen's face froze, the color draining from her cheeks as her eyes locked on the badge. For a second, it was like time itself paused. The crowd, once shifting and murmuring, fell into a hushed silence, eyes flicking between the two women. The weight of the moment settled thick in the air, almost suffocating. Her voice, once loud and commanding, faltered. What is that?" she stammered, though she knew exactly what she was looking at. The black woman didn't answer immediately. She didn't need to. The badge spoke for itself. It wasn't some knockoff or a prop. It was real, unmistakable. The emblem, the letter and the authority it carried, undeniable. Karen blinked rapidly, her confidence wobbling like a table missing a leg. She looked around, searching for backup. But the same crowd she had rallied moments ago was no longer on her side. The whispers that once fed her self-righteousness had shifted, now laced with disbelief and judgment. You're not really FBI," Karen blurted, her voice shaky but still clinging to the last scraps of her delusion. It wasn't a statement of truth. It was a desperate attempt to regain control. The black woman finally spoke, her voice calm, steady, and far more powerful than any of Karen's previous outbursts. "I am, and you are dangerously close to obstructing a federal agent." The words cut through the tension like a blade. Karen flinched, her mouth opening and closing like she wanted to argue, but no words came out. Her bravado cracked, exposing something raw underneath. Fear, maybe even shame, though it wasn't clear which one was winning. The crowd leaned in, hooked on every second of the unfolding drama. No one dared interrupt. I didn't know," Karen mumbled, her voice barely above a whisper now. The woman tilted her head slightly, her gaze unwavering. "You didn't ask." It was a simple statement, but it landed with the weight of a sledgehammer. Karen had never asked. She assumed. She judged. She acted on those assumptions, never once stopped and considered she might be wrong. Karen's breath hitched, her eyes darting around like she was searching for an escape route. But there wasn't one. Not anymore. The power dynamic had shifted entirely, and she wasn't in control of the narrative. For the first time, she looked small, not in stature, but in spirit. The bold, self-assured persona that had fueled her confrontation was gone, leaving behind a woman who seemed unsure of everything, including herself. The black woman didn't gloat. She didn't smirk or revel in Karen's discomfort. Her expression remained composed, professional, but there was something else beneath it, a flicker of disappointment, maybe even sadness. Karen swallowed hard, trying to find her footing. I thought you were. You looked." The woman didn't let her finish. "I looked what?" The question wasn't angry. It wasn't even confrontational. It was quiet, steady, and filled with a weight that made Karen's words die in her throat. I made a mistake," Karen murmured, her voice trembling. The woman held her gaze a second longer, then slowly looked around at the crowd. People shifted awkwardly, unsure what to do or say. Some looked embarrassed for even entertaining Karen's accusations in the first place. A beat passed, then another. The woman exhaled slowly, not in defeat, but in control. She didn't need to stay any longer. The point had been made, even if Karen didn't fully grasp it yet. Without another word, she pocketed her badge and turned to leave, moving with the same quiet confidence she had before any of this started. Karen stood there, rooted in place, watching her go. Her mouth open again like she wanted to call after her, but nothing came out. The crowd started to break apart. people murmuring to one another as they walked away. Some shook their heads. Others glanced back at Karen with looks that ranged from pity to disdain. Karen didn't move. She looked frozen, trapped in the mess she had created, replaying everything that had just unfolded. Her expression flickered between confusion, fear, and something else, something harder to define. And somewhere deep down, though she probably wouldn't admit it, a part of her knew that she wasn't a victim in this story. Not even close. The silence that followed was deafening. Karen stood there, her mind racing to process what had just happened. The badge, the weight of that truth, was something she couldn't unsee. Her face burned hot with a mix of embarrassment and disbelief. She wasn't used to being wrong, and now the world seemed to be staring straight at her, watching her unravel. Her eyes darted to the nearest bystanders, almost pleading for someone to share her outrage, to validate the twisted narrative she had built in her head. But no one was meeting her gaze. The same people who moments ago might have been on her side were now avoiding her, shaking their heads, whispering among themselves. The black woman, meanwhile, was already walking away, her head held high, her step steady and unbothered. There was no victory march in her stride, no smugness or satisfaction, just quiet dignity. It was like she had seen this all before, lived through the same scenario more times than anyone should have to. Karen's throat tightened, her heart pounding. She wasn't used to being the one left speechless. Anger bubbled beneath her humiliation, but it wasn't the righteous kind anymore. It was desperation. Desperation to take back control of the situation, to rewrite the moment into something where she wasn't a villain. She took a shaky breath. "Wait," she blurted out, her voice cutting to the lingering murmurs of the crowd. The black woman paused, but didn't turn around immediately. The crowd's attention snapped back to Karen, eyes wide, waiting to see what would happen next. "I didn't mean," Karen started, but the words fell hollow, even to her. She swallowed hard. "I wasn't trying to. I just thought you looked suspicious, okay? How was I supposed to know who you were?" The black woman slowly turned to face her again. Her expression remained unreadable, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes, something Karen couldn't quite place. "You didn't know," the woman said, her voice low and steady. "But you assumed." Karen blinked, her throat tightening again. "I wasn't trying to be racist." The words tumbled out awkwardly, clumsy and defensive. She felt the weight of the crowd's judgment bearing down on her, making her squirm. "I was just trying to keep everyone safe." The woman's gaze didn't waver. "Safe from what exactly?" Karen's mouth opened, but nothing came out. She didn't have an answer, not a real one. Anyway, she wasn't afraid of anything real. The fear she felt, the one that pushed her to act, wasn't about danger. It was about discomfort, about the assumption she made the moment she laid eyes on the black woman. The realization twisted in her gut, uncomfortable and undeniable. The woman took a step closer, not in a threatening way, but with a quiet kind of authority that demanded attention. "Do you know how often this happens to people who look like me?" she asked, her voice calm but carrying weight. Karen didn't answer. She didn't have to. The woman continued, her words cutting through the tension like a scalpel. "Do you know how exhausting it is to constantly be questioned, followed, accused? Not because of anything we've done, but because of what people like you assume about us? You thought you were protecting people, but the only person causing a problem here was you." Karen's eyes stung. She wanted to argue, to defend herself, to explain that she wasn't that kind of person. She wasn't a bad person. She wasn't racist. She was just mistaken. But deep down, she knew that wasn't enough. The woman stared at her for a moment longer, then shook her head, not in anger, but in something worse, disappointment. Without another word, she turned and walked away again, this time not looking back. The crowd slowly began to disperse, leaving Karen standing there, her heart hammering in her chest. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. How did things spiral so fast? How did she go from feeling so sure of herself to feeling so small? The truth gnawed at her, uncomfortable and relentless. She wasn't a victim here. She never was. And now, no matter how hard she tried to shake the feeling, she knew she couldn't undo what happened. or the way people looked at her now. Karen stood there, rooted to the spot, long after the crowd had dispersed. The world seemed to move on without her, but she couldn't. Her mind replayed the scene over and over again, each time cutting deeper. She could still see the badge, clear as day, shining in the sunlight. It wasn't just the badge that haunted her. It was the look in the black woman's eyes. Calm, unshaken, powerful. And then there was that final glance, filled with disappointment that burned more than any angry outburst ever could. Her throat felt dry, her palms clammy. The hum of passing voices and distant footsteps faded into white noise. Karen wasn't sure what she felt anymore. Embarrassment? Yes. Anger? Maybe. But it wasn't directed at the woman anymore. It was tangled inside her, messy and unresolved. Part of her wanted to convince herself this wasn't her fault. She wasn't a bad person. She wasn't racist. She was just mistaken. That's all. But the more she told herself that, the hollower the words felt. A flicker of a memory surfaced. Something she hadn't thought about in years. Her father, standing tall, telling her that good people do the right thing, even when it's uncomfortable. Back then, she believed she was one of those good people. But now, that belief felt like a distant echo. She didn't realize she had been staring at the ground until a voice startled her. "You okay?" It wasn't the black woman. It was an older man, a bystander who watched everything unfold. His expression wasn't hostile, but it wasn't exactly sympathetic either. It was the look people gave when they weren't sure if someone deserved comfort or a wake-up call. Karen swallowed hard, her voice coming out smaller than she meant it to. I thought I was doing the right thing." The man studied her for a moment, then sighed. "Yeah," he said quietly. "That's what they all think." The words hit harder than she expected. She wanted to ask what he meant, but she already knew. He didn't need to explain. Her legs felt heavy as she finally forced herself to move. Each step fell harder than the last. Her mind wouldn't stop spinning. What would have happened if the woman wasn't FBI? Would Karen have believed her then? Or would she have doubled down, convinced herself she was right no matter what? The thought twisted in her stomach, making her feel sick. She imagined what the woman's day must have been like before their paths crossed. Maybe she was on her way to meet someone. Maybe she was enjoying a rare moment of peace. And then Karen took that away. Not because the woman did anything wrong, but because Karen couldn't let go of the idea that she didn't belong. The worst part was knowing that the badge was the only thing that stopped her. If the woman had been anyone else, anyone without that badge, Karen wasn't sure what she would have done. Would she have kept pushing? Called the police? What would have happened then? She hated the answer forming in her head. Her feet carried her forward, but her heart felt like it was stuck back in that moment, frozen in place. She wondered if the woman felt frozen too, if every time something like this happened, it added another weight to carry. For the first time, Karen didn't feel like the center of the story anymore. She wasn't the hero, and she wasn't the victim. She was a problem. The thought was unbearable. But more than that, it was undeniable.